English translation, 691st contact. Friday the 20th of October 2017, 21:47 hours.
Hello, here you come already. Greetings, dear friend, and welcome, Ptaah. Actually thought you would come after this afternoon's correction, but apparently it was not to be.
Edward, greetings also to you, my friend, and I am only coming now because I had other things to do in the ward that took a long time. Besides, I must say that I am worried about you because, as Anjana and Florina told me, the disturbing influences are causing you particular difficulties at the moment.
That was indeed the case, but it is better now. But my dear Eva has also taken me to the Winterthur Hospital 4 times recently, and finally to the University Hospital in Zurich, where the examinations were always an hour-long ordeal of waiting and absolutely pointless, because of course nothing could be found in terms of illnesses and so on. This was also clearly confirmed by the University Hospital and the hospital in Winterthur, as my doctor, who is also a cardiologist, also wrote to Eva yesterday by email that everything was highly normal with my health. It is also impossible to find any impulses or the like from the treating me, because if you or Yanarara and Zafanat Paneach could only detect and analyze the evil of the with highly sensitive special equipment, how could our earthly doctors do that with their still earthly primitive medical possibilities, which have no relevance at all for such clarifications and investigations? Even with your highly developed and highly sensitive equipment, you needed several months to even be able to register and analyze the malignant influences. Of course, I defend myself mentally against these malicious influences to the best of my ability, but they still hit me. Now, however, I have found out something and I am acting accordingly. Consequently, I feel better again. But I do not want to talk about it openly because uninitiated persons would not understand the whole thing.
I would be interested to know what you are doing about it, though. That is effective.
Good, then the following.
What you say is plausible, but to speak openly about it would indeed not be good. Because by all Earth humans who are uninitiated in this respect, the whole thing would not be understood and would therefore be rejected as unreal, which is unfortunately also the case with some core group members who do not think their way into this matter, do not deal with it, and can therefore also neither accept nor understand it.
Exactly, that would lead to declaring all of us, or at least me, crazy.
I guess that would be so.
Then something else. Just today on television, something was confirmed again that we already talked about a long time ago and, as far as I know, also openly announced, namely that due to the irresponsibility of the human beings of the Earth as a result of the criminal machinations arising from overpopulation, more and more in nature is being destroyed, and the fauna and floral life forms are being wiped out without salvation. Now, according to the latest research, it has been proven that in the course of the last few years and up to the present time, around 55% of the bird world and 75% of the insect world have already been wiped out in the European area. In my opinion, this now already means that a catastrophe is in progress, because both the absence of birds and insects to the extent mentioned will affect pollination and the growth of natural foodstuffs to such an extent that famines may ultimately result from the whole thing, and human beings may starve to death.
We do not need to talk about this at length another time. I will just briefly explain that the blame for the ecological catastrophe that has arisen and is now underway lies first and foremost with all the manufacturers, companies and corporations that produce chemical toxins and put them on the market. This is in relation to pesticides and herbicides of many kinds, the latest of which, neonicotinoids or neonicotinoids, are a group of highly effective insecticides, all of which are synthetically produced toxic agents. The toxic substances bind to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor NACHR of nerve cells, disrupting the transmission of nerve impulses because the receptor is permanently stimulated by the toxic substances, and consequently there are disturbances in chemical signal transmission. Neonicotinoids have a much stronger selective effect on the nerve cells of insects than on those of vertebrates, that is to say, amphibians. as well as bony and cartilaginous fish, reptiles, mammals, birds, and many other living beings in great diversity, although as vertebrate carriers, human beings are also included. Neonicotinoids and all toxic substances of any kind that act as contact or fracing poisons are absorbed by all life forms via the skin. Respiration, water, and food when they are sprayed into the air or directly or indirectly into food plants, etc., and onto the skin. Toxic substances, such as neonicotinoids, are absorbed by plants through the roots and transported into the leaves, while other toxins are absorbed directly through the leaves and stems and accumulate in the plants. Due to their systemic effect, neonicotinoids are mainly used as seed dressings, although they are also used, for example, as granules, sprays, or as an additive to irrigation water. Neonicotinoids are broken down extremely slowly in plants, so the toxic effect lasts for a long time and is only destroyed when the plant dies, withers, and rots. This means, however, that plants treated with such toxins always contain toxins to a certain extent that are harmful to the health of all life forms, so also to Earth humans. So it is a deliberate, malicious lie spread for profit by the toxin manufacturers and their researchers as well as the toxin users, especially in agriculture and horticulture, but also by the health authorities, that residual toxins in natural as well as chemical foodstuffs are harmless to Earth humans. And the danger and harmfulness to health is much greater and more extensive than Earth humans are aware of, because the manufacturers of the poisons, who themselves and their researchers know the facts about the lethality of their products, conceal the effective truth with malicious, deliberate lies. The farmers and horticulturists, who are partly responsible for the unconscionable use of toxins in a manifold and irresponsible manner due to greed for profit, are also burdened with great guilt, because their actions kill several million Earth humans worldwide every year, whereby the entire fauna and flora and especially the necessary insect world are also killed and destroyed, as well as the necessary bird life. Pesticides and herbicides are sometimes equated with insecticides, which are also highly toxic chemical substances that are used irresponsibly to kill or drive away insects and other living creatures that are considered a nuisance or harmful in agriculture and gardening. On the other hand, herbicides are used to inhibit or completely destroy plants in their germination, growth, or reproduction. In principle, the use of pesticides, herbicides, and other toxins when applied to ecosystems is not without consequences. Even when such pesticides and herbicides are used in small amounts, there are certainly high risks to the health of life forms, including Earth humans, but the toxins also have a detrimental, destructive, and devastating effect on wide areas of the environment. The main focus with regard to pesticide, herbicide, and other poison residues is the pollution of natural foodstuffs, which are contaminated with pesticide residues and insecticides and cause illness in many life forms and therefore also in Earth humans.
To this can only be said again and again what we have often explained. However, on your last visit, we now discuss some things in an open manner that...
We did, but with that all must come to terms who will read what our conversation has revealed, and that too when no understanding can be mustered.
Then in the report of the conversation I will leave everything as it was just spoken between us. Consequently, I will not leave anything out.
Of course, but nothing more should be said about it in an open manner.
Good, but yet a question concerning these, which affect me so viciously. We spoke of the matter of Einsideln and of Corinthos and Merauli on your last visit, but I did not remember what the monastery in Greece was actually called. Do you perhaps still have a memory of it?
Yes, of course. It was about the monastery called Monastery of Saint Patapiou at Loutrakion. It was effectively the forces, that is, not those as is the case with regard to the machinations concerning the effects on your computer, which in the meantime could be clearly proven by Zaphanat Panek and which are based on the one hand on external intrusions into your computer and into Bernadette's, whereby these disturbances, on the other hand, take place via the electricity lines and unfortunately cannot be stopped, because otherwise the electrical power supply would have to be blocked.
These external controlled disturbances on my computer, which recently also occur with Bernadette, are always attributed by some of our experts at the center to the fact that we would do something wrong with the computers themselves, tinker with them, and thus manipulate them.
This is nonsense. Because Zafanat Panich could clearly and undoubtedly prove these technical energy influences, namely that they penetrate the computers via the electrical energy lines, as well as that they sometimes cause very considerable disturbances and affect the work of you and Bernadette. The findings of Zafanat Panich in this regard are really clear and prove external technical influences via the power lines, which cannot be blocked, because throughout the center all electrical and electronic apparatus and devices of every kind depend on the power supply, which of course must not be blocked.
Everything is clear to me, but I guess it's pointless to talk about it any further. Today I want to talk about what I have been thinking about a lot lately, and because I had two visions, I have also made probability calculations. However, this results in a different way from all the prophecies and predictions, some of which date back to the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and also from later years, and are mainly contained in the book Prophecies and Predictions. Many of the predictions mentioned in this book, as well as many other things I have predicted in letters and bulletins, have come true since then and are happening now, as they will in the future. But now I have some other future things which I have calculated according to my two visions, and when I include in my explanations and declarations, etc., those who are powerful in the state, those who govern and those who are politicians, as well as the miseries which prevail in these and in the affairs of state, etc., then this always and only refers to the faults of the state leaders, etc., and to their faults. And I say this because I am absolutely aware that among the state powers, rulers, civil servants, and politicians, etc., there are also very good human beings who are aware of their duty, who do their best and good, and who make an effort to fulfill their work standard and their performance target to the best of their ability and capability. I am also absolutely clear about the fact that the state laws, rules of order, and ordinances are also quite justified and on the whole in order. Consequently, nothing negative is to be objected to them, as is also the case with regard to the righteous state powers, state officials, rulers and politicians, etc. Consequently, in every case of my statements, declarations and objections, it is to be understood that I am only denouncing the machinations of the majority of unrighteous state leaders, state officials and politicians, etc., who hold their offices only for the sake of their might and remuneration, not for the sake of the people's well-being, order, freedom, and peace. Furthermore, I also denounce only the wrong laws, rules of order and ordinances, etc., which are hostile to human beings and freedom, as well as illogical, and not and in no way all that which is correct, good, and effectively necessary in terms of law, order, and ordinances. And all that falls within this framework of correctness with regard to laws, rules of order and ordinances, as well as governance, etc., allows the human beings to live largely well as in peace and freedom, and also in a certain security, as is the case at least with us in Switzerland. But this is no longer a matter of course in today's world, with the ever-increasing serious criminality, the ever-growing criminality and the ever-increasing terrorism, as well as the emerging anarchism, which unfortunately is not yet recognized by those responsible, and the growing racial and religious hatred, the generally growing discord, the disruption of families, and everything is simply maddening with the human beings of the earth, because everything they do is completely idiotic. Because the more human beings populate the earth, the more are still being conceived and put into the world, and the more the mass of overpopulation increases, the more the public services are counterproductively dismantled and restricted. For example, the services of the authorities, which are also charging the citizens more and more fees for all kinds of and even the smallest services, whereby the official war of forms is also becoming more and more complicated. Furthermore, Public bus services and state and private rail and road transport services and the possibilities of transport connections are also being drastically reduced, with the prices for their use being constantly increased. Also, more and more railway stations and transport stops and post offices are being dismantled, as are banks and bank branches, which charge ever higher fees for their customer-friendly administrative work. Hospitals and doctors' surgeries, etc. are also being closed down more and more, while all the others that remain impose enormous costs on patients and literally rob them blind. But this goes on in the same framework with corporate bosses, company owners, bosses, professional sportsmen, especially footballers, and boards of directors, etc., who demand ever more immense undeserved rewards, whereby the individual reward recipients in this respect receive sums in the millions, which are set at over 10 and 12 million Swiss francs per year. This, while the normal employees, depending on the position, are paid 3,000, 4,000 Swiss francs, or in better positions up to 10,000 or 12,000 Swiss francs or euros per month, even though they are the ones who effectively do the hard work, while the big-mouthed bosses loll around lazily in their showy armchairs, hardly doing a thing and just running their big mouths. All that is left is to scam immense financial resources and to obtain horrendous fortunes. Also, newly elected, self-important rich people are always making an effort to be elected as representatives of the people in the governments, where they then burden the people financially more and more by exploiting them with new taxes of all kinds, be it with value-added taxes or taxes on the turnover of goods, etc., because the only thing that is important to them is that they fleece the citizens through the tax system and can themselves collect and pocket horrendous unearned salaries and later high pensions for life. This, while those of the population who have to work hard for a living and at low wages have to pay horrendous taxes until their couches ache. And this does not even stop at the old human beings who have to live or vegetate on meager pensions and state support money, because even the support money they receive from the state is still subject to horrendous tax levies, as a result of which they have to live in poverty and cannot afford anything that would meet their needs. But how else can one call those rulers who presumptuously and arbitrarily keep inventing new taxes in order to exploit the taxpayers on the one hand and to fill the state coffers on the other, so that they themselves can collect horrendous salaries and later pensions that are several times higher than what the effective workers have to earn hard and laboriously? And that it is clearly stated, by these state idiots and state criminals, I do not mean the righteous rulers and state officials, but effectively only those exploiters of the people who use their positions to exploit the hard-working populations again and again with new taxes, as well as with official and state stamp and writing fees, in order to fill the coffers of the authorities and the state, and to collect horrendous salaries themselves, and to live in glory and joy and to be able to afford everything, while the working class lives more poorly than well, and the poor have to miserably starve. And this is unfortunately also the case in Switzerland, as in all other countries, where certain unrighteous people in government, as high-handed elements over the heads of the righteous people in the rest of government, do everything to financially exploit the population through new taxes and fees, etc., and to enrich themselves through unearned rewards and pensions, be it through general direct or indirect taxes, through higher road tolls and motorway tolls, customs duties, and what is particularly regrettable is that the righteous of those in power allow themselves to be condemned to silence and withhold their vote by these conscienceless and anti-people elements, who are elected to government through their populist machinations, or allow themselves to be influenced and persuaded to go along with such popular exploitative machinations. And this is an epidemic that has spread far and wide, and also throughout the entire extra-official and extra-state, and indeed practically in all private and economic sectors, such as in relation to the post office, doctors, hospitals, spy techs and other care organizations, banks, dentists, companies and tradesmen, and so on. However, all this is not only criminal, but also criminal, because financially criminal, unscrupulous and money-grubbing elements get hold of ever more immense fortunes in every state-permitted way, set themselves high above the working class, dominate it and run an uncontrollable criminal capitalism, to which the working class, respectively the female and male effective laborers, must subordinate themselves and allow themselves to be exploited by the capital sharks. Of course, this is not understood by the entire working people and even by the entire population, as a result of which everything continues in this sad framework and the entire working people become poorer and poorer, more and more underpaid and more exploited and do not defend themselves against it, while the big capitalists and other millionaire creeps become richer and wealthier. And the peak of the whole thing is that the righteous and reasonable authorities and governments do nothing against it, but simply go along with it within the same framework, which can only happen because they, like the citizens and the people, simply let everything happen without fighting back against these abuses. And they do this as a result of their blind faith in their authorities and governments, because they are trapped in their faith in and obedience to the authorities and are therefore no longer capable of thinking and acting for themselves, but only allow the authorities and governments as well as the political parties to think for them, and are nothing more than their recipients and executors of orders. And since this is the case, the citizens are effectively no longer free human beings, but politically controlled serfs by the authorities, governments and political parties, who no longer have any civil courage whatsoever, who cower like whipped dogs and allow themselves to be forced further and further into bondage and a lack of self-initiative. The human beings of today have become completely lacking in initiative, and as a result they also no longer defend themselves, or in extreme emergencies only when they no longer have anything worth defending. And if it actually comes to the point that they wake up from their lethargy, then they go completely berserk in an unreasonable way, become berserk and mobile in a way that degenerates to such an extent that they go blindly berserk, smash everything to pieces in a vicious and blind rage and do more harm than good. The out-of-control factor of intellect and reason then only allows blind hatred and boundless rage, which can no longer be countered by contemplation, because every clear-thinking ability, insight and every capacity for knowledge, every cleverness, every acumen and every capacity for judgment degenerates as a result of degenerating brutality. Resentment, discontent, vindictiveness and hostility, etc., in such a way that only absolutely uncontrollable blind rage and fanaticism is acted upon. In this state it is to be hoped that after the inevitable degenerations at least something will remain, and that in the end reason and rationality will prevail again, so that with a lot of work, effort and toil order and progress can be restored. However, the fact must be that the small clique of the power-obsessed, the upper-rich and the capitalistically wealthy, who own the world because of their financial might, can no longer control it. If this happens, then it must be clearly regulated that the entire populations of the earth are no longer governed by capitalism, but that in future the peoples in true democracy determine world events and regulate everything in such a way that equality prevails for all human beings in every respect, and also with regard to remuneration, so that some do not have to languish poor and in misery, while the others are filthy rich and can rejoice and live in glory. This, however, requires that the human beings of the earth wake up from their torpor, begin to think for themselves, and apply reason and intelligence in order to also stop the further disastrous globalization, which has already progressed so far through capitalism and especially through the capital bosses and their money-grubbing machinations that nature has also been involved and thrown into turmoil in a devastating way. Therefore, the entire earthly population or the entire humanity must finally learn to think independently and clearly, and not let the authorities and the political parties as well as the powerful capitalists think for them, but rather make an effort to think independently on their own. Independent thinking is based, on the one hand, on the human being seeking, collecting, and absorbing information from as many different sources as possible in order to compare them with each other and draw his or her own conclusions. Independent thinking is not only desirable, but it must be the duty of human beings. Consequently, they must demand it of themselves, whereby this should actually be learned in principle at an early age through education and then also through self-education, because only this creates the possibility of forming one's own opinion. Unfortunately, however, it is the case that very many human beings, even if they are already adults, are not able to form their own opinion because they have never learned to think for themselves. And these human beings are also unable to have their say on issues that are central to them, to think about them, and also to form their own opinions. Consequently, they are also unable to question the opinions of other human beings, but simply adopt them thoughtlessly, and thus live under the delusion that these opinions are correct and also their own. Human beings, however, who are not able to think for themselves, are generally not able to recognize independent thinking as such, because in reality it does not exist at all, but is only an assumed product of foreign and pre-chewed thinking. Recently I had two visions in this respect and also in relation to the distant future, which were extremely frightening and affected me. Subsequently, I have thought more deeply about all the perceived factors and the coming effects, and I have also carried out probability calculations, precisely what can result from everything in the future time, and that looks not only absolutely unpleasant, but catastrophic, and leads to a future Armageddon. Accordingly, I have summarized a number of things that are above all also connected with the rapidly growing overpopulation, which will lead to more and more catastrophes all over the world through its inevitably ever more blatant machinations. This was also announced by prophecies, as they are also mentioned in the prophecy book, which predicted immense conflagrations in the USA, where for years there have been more and more evil conflagrations that destroy and devastate entire villages and districts as well as landscapes. This is also the case at the moment, as a powerful conflagration with fire tornadoes has destroyed several villages and already far more than 6,000 residential buildings, but also other buildings and also forests, destroying them to the ground. But what I have calculated in terms of probability with regard to the madness of overpopulation in the future, time represents, if everything actually turns out according to my calculations, an enormous and unprecedented catastrophe for humanity alone. However, the whole thing will be preceded by various extremely unpleasant factors, which I will, however, only elaborate on after what, according to my visions and calculations, will result in the future after the greatest catastrophe of humanity, if, under certain circumstances, a violent extermination of humanity on a grand scale actually takes place, which, if it really happens, will be brought about and exercised by the state powers and the capital elites, etc. So I start with the results from my calculation point of view, which is about 34% probability for some things, but about 56% probability for most things, but which can increase depending. But even now with this percentage, there is a danger that this probability possibility can happen. These percentage results already show that the whole thing, if it really increases and actually occurs and thus becomes reality, will be so monstrous in the future that everything will be almost incomprehensible and unbearable for normal people. So now I will mention everything that I have calculated in terms of probability according to my two visions, starting with what will ultimately happen if my visions and probability calculations should come true. After that, I will mention the various factors that will add up to the end that will be inevitable if humanity does not quickly change for the better, in order to introduce a worldwide birth stop and birth control and also democratic governments based on citizenship. For this to happen, however, all unrighteous elements of the state, government, authorities and politicians would have to be removed from office and replaced by righteous forces who are effectively close to the people, who exercise their offices in accordance with citizenship, and who carry out the business of government of all kinds democratically in accordance with the pure will of the people. But what I have to say and calculate in terms of probability corresponds to a somewhat extensive matter, which I have already prescribed, because the whole thing would be too extensive to keep everything in mind. So I can read everything here from the computer and now set out what my visions and probability calculations have produced, and that is the following.
The great misery and end of the overpopulation song will be that the world elites will recognize that the preservation of their might can only be guaranteed by drastically reducing overpopulation, whereby this reduction of humanity threatens to be carried out in a criminal manner by the world powers in the future. If the mass increase of overpopulation is not ended in the foreseeable future by a drastic worldwide birth stop and is classified under a worldwide birth control, The world powers, that is to say the powers of the state, the powers of the nations, and the powers of capital, which as such form the world elite, which on the whole are also strongly biased towards religion and sectarianism and will also be so in the future, will be much more vicious and worse in the ways and means of their actions than the war crimes and crimes against humanity which were committed by the Nazi atrocities. This future world powerful elite will know no mercy and will carry out an annihilation of humanity that could not be more terrible. And for this, various possibilities are likely to emerge, such as that various traditional deadly epidemics will be reworked and prepared with new deadly agents, but also artificially produced diseases will be used to decimate humanity. Likewise, the calculations also indicate that infectious toxic biological substances would be secretly used to decimate humanity and that their deadly effects will be presented as new and incurable epidemics, whereby these toxins will then penetrate the entire organism via the respiratory tract and the mouth as well as via the skin and mucous membranes, whereby unstoppable mass deaths will inevitably occur. Purposefully induced famines and wars, poisoning of food and drinking water will also be part of the arsenal of decimating human beings to a still governable minimum, which will occur worldwide, so not only in individual murderous and dictatorially led states. A thermonuclear war to depopulate the majority of Earth humans must also be considered in order to reduce them to such an extent that they can be governed again. Consequently, also a genocide or human murder on an unprecedented scale can result.
But before all this happens, according to my probability calculations, the following degenerations will take place.
In general, extremely complicated changes are already taking place in the whole world and will expand in the coming time, which will have governmental, political, capitalist, military, economic, and civic implications caused by the behavior of incompetence in power, who, through wrong decisions, mismanagement, claims to power in other countries, suppression of freedom and peace in many respects in their own states, etc., will give rise to uprisings and revolts. Give reason for uprisings and revolts. The small and large states all over the world will arm themselves militarily with the most modern weapons to an unprecedented extent, whereby instead of peace, freedom, and security, the whole will generally become more and more a great danger for quarrels with neighboring states and for armed conflicts and wars. In general, throughout the world, anarchist groups of the population will carry out more and more serious attacks on police organs and also claim human lives, in addition to causing destruction of state property, which may ultimately lead to military intervention against the corresponding groups if the security organs are no longer able to control them. Along with the USA and Russia, China is now also rising to the position of world politics and, since the Korean War, is now leaving its previous traditional purely observing, passive and spectator position and is transforming itself into a self-confident great and world power and into a new, flourishing Chinese nation with an impressively rising economy, whereby the Socialist People's Republic of China will no longer make any secret of its ambitions as a leading power and great power, etc., on the world political stage and will also massively arm itself militarily in every respect. The number of refugees will continue to rise and will continue to rise in the future. Ultimately, 250 to 350 million human beings on Earth will leave their home countries as refugees and disperse all over the world. In this respect, Europe in particular, as a result of the mismanagement of refugees through the stupidity of false humanist rulers and population groups, will promote the whole thing, causing new suffering and diseases and spreading turmoil, whereby hostility against foreigners and racial as well as religious and sectarian hatred, criminality, and crime will also increase. The coming times will bring many technological developments, but this will bring benefits as well as disadvantages and harm to humanity. nature and its fauna and flora, respectively the entire ecosystems and the climate, will be increasingly destroyed and annihilated by the degenerating criminal machinations and effects of overpopulation. As a result of the irrational authorizations granted for this purpose by governments with regard to environmentally destructive machinations. The state powers, rulers and politicians are also responsible for this, often also the military as well as the lobbyists, private actors, the populists, and all other actors who, with their growing might and their dirty fingers, reach into the governments and help to further destroy nature, its fauna and flora, and the climate. In addition, the inhibition threshold is being broken down everywhere, which could still prevent much violence, which in increasing form through degeneracy, indifference, hatred, discord and envy, etc., will arise as malignant consequences from the growing overpopulation, as well as from their machinations. Evil resource struggles between states will arise and lead to war and armed conflicts. The rapidly increasing technical development as a phenomenon of the progressive times in the 21st century will be underestimated in its negativity, because it will bring great dangers with it, through which ultimately the future of the whole of humanity and thus also that of future generations will be put at risk. All over the world, states will again and again fall into turmoil because of civil and separatist unrest, which will lead to serious domestic and economic uprisings, riots and violence and turmoil. As has been the case since ancient times, also in the times to come the believers in God will fight each other, hate each other and make enemies of each other, not only the believers of various religions, but also of the sects, whereby also in this way religious strife and religious terrorism will flare up again and malignant strife. Hatred as well as wars, massacres and expulsions, suffering, the distress and misery will befall humanity. And this will continue to happen and repeat itself as long as religions and the sects resulting from them exist and also as long as new ones are formed. The rulers, the state powers and politicians, the large part of whom are already populist, but lobbyists are also involved, are increasingly falling prey to various forms of populism and are coming to power with populist agitation, fraudulent promises and lies, leading the populations into confusion and, through misguidance, into distress, difficulties and doubts as well as into unregulated, order-destroying and state-threatening conditions. Whereas in Europe, apart from Switzerland, where unfortunately also various populists and lobbyists can do their mischief to the detriment of the rights and freedom of the citizens, also Germany and of course the EU dictatorship as well as especially France, England and Holland and also Austria, through populists and lobbyists in the governments and among the politicians, curtail the people in their rights, put them at a disadvantage and exploit them financially through new levies and taxes, etc., and this also through new taxes and levies, and will also do so in the future. The public media of all kinds are also increasingly becoming a populist power factor, through whose machinations and since the populations are influenced and controlled in a media populist way, whereby through the media and their power, false information that serves them is spread and misleads the populations. Populist-created and controlled conspiracy theories and lie reports will appear more and more, mislead the peoples of all countries and make them believers of all those who make horrendous profits from the whole of the conspiracy lies, exploiting the people and at the same time dominating the populations. The political risks are increasing more and more dramatically, as well as with regard to humanitarian concerns, economic problems, the entire national economy and companies, whereby there are also great dangers from wars and the international risk of terrorism, and thus security risks also play a major role. The current world situation, and the one to come, has become so dangerous that it is already in many ways more dangerous than it was when the Cold War still prevailed, and this will now become even more so. in the absolute foreground of all coming evil, negative and bad changes through interference in foreign countries' internal and external affairs, events, courses of action, conflicts and problems, etc., is the world domination-addicted USA, which, obsessed with power, as it has been since time immemorial, is increasingly interfering in the dealings and domestic and foreign political affairs, concerns and interests of other states, and thus provoking unrest, discord, the wars, and other armed conflicts. Hardly established and achieved positive alliances, connections, agreements, and treaties between various states and organizations, etc., are partially or totally dissolved and fall apart, whereby the USA is often the driving force for this, thereby again and again provoking hostilities between countries and great insecurity, unrest, discord, revolutions, and the danger of war. The USA and the US government will be exposed to many threats in the future, which will come from governmental and non-governmental anti-state actors, but also from large parts of the US population, whereby the US population will split into different population groups, for which the basic factors have already been created, and consequently the US population is already separating into different groups today. Again and again, new enmities arise between various states, which lead to political and economic differences and to evil and destructive wars and armaments, whereby a fourth world war must constantly be considered again and again. In this respect, the criminal and criminal world domination and world police airs and political machinations of the USA are particularly in the foreground as a driving force. Worldwide, various states are increasingly coming to the brink of collapse in terms of public order, with a worsening of the poor security situation both internally and externally due to extreme terrorist and military as well as dictatorial machinations. Russia will become the target of terrorists despite the government's efforts elsewhere, with Islamist attacks from the autonomous regions of Dagestan and Chechnya threatening in particular. The nuclear powers, for the sake of their lust for power, and to maintain it, will wage wars with nuclear weapons, as well as with other weapons of mass destruction, spreading misery, death, misery, to destruction and annihilation across the earth. Raw materials will become so scarce that states will start and wage degenerating wars over them, with certain great nuclear powers in particular using their deadly weapons ruthlessly. The prosperity of all mankind is threatened already today and even more so in the future by authoritarian tendencies of the ruling elites, politicians, populists, and capitalists, which will inevitably also be accompanied by social disintegration. Humans will bring forth the most ruthless and life and human despising systems of rule such as have never before appeared on earth, whereby those exercising power and rule, those greedy for property and those powerful with capital will row the ship of humanity from one catastrophe to another. Terrorism, both religious, sectarian, political, and anti-human being and anti-state, will become more and more prevalent worldwide, just as the deadly and destructive terrorist attacks of all kinds all over the world will claim more and more human lives and cause enormous destruction. All global terrorism will strike again and again and become a nightmare for Earth humans. Political risks are increasing worldwide and threaten to degenerate into instability, all kinds of armed conflicts as well as into wars and acts of terrorism, whereby the degenerated danger of terrorism will also increase considerably in this respect and drive the world to the brink of collapse. The unstoppable growth of overpopulation and the whole mismanagement of all kinds and in all fields will continue to drive up the unemployment figures worldwide and will reach forms which will cause tremendous problems, as has never been the case in previous periods of unemployment. In the economy as a whole, wages for employees will drop very low and cause enormous financial problems in all strata of the working classes, while the whole social system will also suffer damage and collapse, then the rapidly increasing crime rate will also cause enormous problems. Speculators will cause a global financial and economic crisis, the like of which has never been seen before, as a result of which the entire financial economy will be in great distress, and there will also be much disaster and great shortages of economic goods. Also in the USA, the population is to be expropriated as a result of the worldwide financial crisis, which will lead to vicious violence being used against the enraged and partly heavily armed population by military and police forces. The planned ban on cash is intended to bring about the expropriation of the people, but the elite of the ruling class and capitalism will be able to swim in joy and glory. And the entire financial system of the whole world is to be overturned in order to also reorganize all existing national debts of all countries, and in such a way that generally only the populations of the states are harmed. There are already secret plans in the USA and in the EU dictatorship to start a war against Russia from Germany, which is to be cited as the reason for the entire emerging world crisis. And it is clear from the outset that the blame for this war will be laid at the door of the Russians, of course completely unjustly, if it actually comes about. And if this war actually takes place, then martial law will be derived from it, which will suppress the enraged population, which will be completely dispossessed by strong and ruthless military and police forces. Already today there are countries which in reality only correspond to so-called nominal states and which are effectively no longer independent states, but exist only in name as such and no longer have any state authority of their own. Basically, these are only open territories teeming with criminal gangs and ruled by guerrilla fighters and warlords. Europe so corresponds to an area that is sullied by crime and criminality, but is also dominated by the EU dictatorship, which is a highly dangerous dictatorship that contributes a great deal to the instability of international politics and is also a starting point and, at the same time, a plating of international terrorism, and from which threats will emanate in the future through military force. But the EU dictatorship is also the source of criminal and criminal machinations by criminals and will be increasingly so in the future, such as drug, human being and arms trafficking, whereby the longer, the more order cannot be brought about. Efforts will be made to expropriate Greece's population, as will also be attempted with other states on occasion. The pension institutions will no longer be able to pay out pensions because they are running out of funds. On the one hand, due to the aging of pensioners. On the other hand, because the number of pensioners is increasing due to the growing mass of overpopulation and the overall cost of living is rising, and with it the need for pensions, the increase and even payment of which will become increasingly questionable. Many states will get into pecuniary distress due to senseless financial expenditures and overburdening, whereby the entire state structures and banks as well as the economy will collapse as a result of inevitable bankruptcy. All social systems worldwide will collapse, whereby more and more human beings will fall into deepest poverty, will no longer be able to enjoy health care, and will also die of hunger and misery, because they will no longer be able to finance their entire livelihood and therefore also their own nutrition and health. Independent and sovereign states will in future be regarded by the USA as the greatest threat and enemies of US America, whereby, as has been the case since time immemorial, Russia, from the confused US point of view, will increasingly be proclaimed as the greatest danger to American security. The USA is increasingly bringing immense quantities of the most modern heavy weapons to Europe, which are stationed in Germany and in the states bordering on Russia, whereby Russia does not simply accept this and is upgrading its own nuclear arsenal and also all other weapons as well as the Russian army or the entire Russian armed forces. Already today there are not only two world powers, the USA and Russia, because there are also various regional superpowers, some of which are nuclear-armed and have international airs and graces, with the EU dictatorship leading the way, followed by Brazil, India, Japan, Nigeria, and South Africa. This, however, increases the insecurity for all states and the whole world, because they are all arming themselves more and more, not simply to protect themselves against attacks, but also to possibly attack neighboring states. One day, the populations of many countries will become more and more dissatisfied with the emerging governmental miseries and will revolt up to the point of insurrection, from which the danger of civil wars will arise. The rulers and financial powers who rule over the populations laxly and falsely, as well as elitist, power-hungry, selfish and autocratic, will no longer be sure of their lives and will be forced to defend their lives as well as their goods and chattels, which will only be possible, if at all, if they have themselves protected by bodyguards or even their own mercenary troops. The elites of the ruling and moneyed aristocracy, together with corrupt politicians, will create worldwide total and dictatorial surveillance states and thus preserve their rule. The financial world promotes capitalism the longer, the more, whereby the whole thing will degenerate into nationalistic form or fascist manner, in order to possibly prevent and nip in the bud other systems emerging and against capitalism.
Your visions and probability calculations are connected with similar calculations which I also made 3 decades ago and which can actually come true if nothing changes for the good and correct in the entire earthly world politics, the forms of government, the entire economy, and in the overall behavior of the earth humans, as well as in their mind and reason. And what has to be done for this good and correct also includes effective rules for a worldwide birth stop to be adopted and implemented very quickly, and a decisive birth control, in order to bring humanity back to a planet and nature-compatible level, which for the Earth amounts to 529 million. Whereby, however, for the decimation of Earth humans, a figure between 1 and 1.5 billion will be calculated, as my own probability calculations showed 3 decades ago. Of course, my probability calculations 3 decades ago showed even less possibility percentages, namely only their approximately 47.7%, which, however, have massively increased since then. I have not carried out any foresight in the calculations in this regard. But my probability calculations also clearly show, like yours, that they actually have a certain greater predictive possibility of occurrence. This, however, will expand if in the entire political, economic, and general world events, as well as in the general overall behavior of Earth humans with regard to their intellect and reason, not everything changes decisively, and no progressive and logical behavior and actions arise which can guarantee a healthy continuation of Earth humans.
That is interesting, because I did not know that you too had made such calculations and that I have now arrived at the same kind of results with my calculations as yours. To me, this means that in our calculations there must be at least a greater probability of fulfillment. But back to what I have calculated with regard to the fact that in the future the peoples can no longer be governed by the state powers, etc., and by the capital elite. As I have calculated, the beginning of this has already been created many decades ago. And in order to recognize and understand this, one only has to look back to the 19th and 20th centuries, in the course of which large and state-uncontrollable criminal organizations arose all over the world, which have enormous might and exercise it even in the affairs of state. But it is also a fact that the leaders of the state are increasingly governing without regard for the well-being and interests of the peoples, whereby there is already such a discrepancy between the rulers and the people that no agreement can be found and everything can only fall into a deeper misery than is already the case. And this is also contributed to by the whole party system, which is fragmented into different interests instead of being structured into a compatible, logical, peaceful, rational, progressive, and beneficial unity.
I also agree with that.
Exactly. And what I want to say in relation to the disorder that has prevailed for a long time in all states. Those criminal organizations stand out particularly, which neither the security forces, such as the police, etc., nor the authorities, state powers, and the military can do anything to. For the most brutal gangs or criminal organizations in the world today, violence, might, murder, trafficking in human beings and drugs, as well as manslaughter. All kinds of organized crime and effectively religiously degenerated fanaticism are in the foreground, against which nothing can be done in a legal and righteous way for about 200 years. Most of these gangs and criminal organizations, which are not simply criminal but effectively criminal and stop at nothing, were founded not only in Central and North America to defend ethnic interests, but also in Europe, Arabia, Asia, and especially in China and Japan. In the meantime, their influence has spread and increased so uncontrollably throughout the world that their brutality, ruthlessness and lack of conscience, murder and killing, as well as their unscrupulousness and viciously degenerated violence, have also grown and are becoming more and more rampant, as a result of which Earth humans are being increasingly and inexorably tyrannized. Such deadly criminal organizations have existed since time immemorial, and they continue to appear. But since the beginning of modern times in 1844, they have become more and more frequent and worse. Also in terms of the techniques of torture, murder, killing, and violence. And since then, new techniques of all kinds have been used for this purpose. Some of these criminal organizations have worldwide networks and terrorize not only individual countries, but all earthly states, without it being possible to seriously oppose them due to their ramifications. For example, the religious sectarian political terrorist networks Al-Qaeda and the Islamist State, both of which, as a worldwide form of transnational terrorism, have large parts of the world in their sights and want to force a change in the international economic or ruling order through vicious torture, violence, murder, manslaughter, and destruction. And this will remain so in the future, even if IS has been defeated and crushed in Iraq and Syria, because the humanity criminal Islamic State is and Al-Qaeda have spread, established themselves and divided into many different groups throughout the world in such a way that there is no longer even a clear overview of them, and it is also no longer clear to which original terrorist organizations they can be assigned. One thing is certain, however, and that is that behind this terrorism lies a religious sectarian mania and fanaticism that demands the blood and death of innocent human beings because they are of a different religious faith or belong to other social classes or other peoples. There is also a whole range of other forms of terrorism, such as national terrorism, which is limited in its objectives and radius of action to the territory of one state, as is the case, for example, with the Maoist movements in Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and was also the case with the RAF in the Federal Republic of Germany. Then there is also international terrorism, which has internal state goals, but whose radius of action extends far beyond national borders, whereby uninvolved third parties also become victims, as is the case, for example, with the Philippine Abu Sayyaf terrorist organization. But in terms of terrorism, there are other forms, such as social revolutionary terrorism, right-wing terrorism, ethnic terrorism, nationalist terrorism, homegrown terrorism, or homegrown terrorism. Homegrown terrorism, conservative vigilantist terrorism, vigilant =alert, clever, nimble, resourceful. Smart, right-wing terrorism due to violated sense of justice, state terrorism, and eco-terrorism, whereby a number of other forms of terrorism exist, which would be too much to list. But there are also gangs and criminal organizations that are known all over the world, such as the Mafia in Italy and the USA, etc., Yakuza in Japan, Hell's Angels, the Triads in China, the Mara Salvatrucha Aryan Brotherhood in the USA, Mexican Mafia, Black Guerrilla Family, that is to say Black Family, that is to say Black Vanguard in the USA, Crips in the USA to Canada, and finally the Blood Alliance, that is to say Bloods in the USA, among many others.
All this is really very bad.
You can say that, but now something else, because just recently there was another program on television that dealt with the Naples caldera. When Svath and I were at the supervolcano Phlegrean Fields, southeast of Naples in Italy, He showed me with the help of highly sensitive measuring instruments how the ground was rising and trembling and how gases were also flowing out. Which is also the case today because the entire caldera, which also has a connection with Vesuvius, is restless and working towards an eruption. Also, every now and then something is reported on television about Europe's supervolcano, which is increasingly rumbling and which is actually working towards an eruption, as your father Svath explained in the 1940s, also saying that actually practically the whole Mediterranean belongs to the caldera and that on the seabed there are many smaller volcanoes which are also constantly active through small eruptions. However, the volcano Vesuvius, which is located to the southeast of Naples and is probably known to the majority of the European population, is not the great danger, but rather what is less well known, the even more dangerous giant located nearby, the Naples caldera or the supervolcano, which is simply called the Phlegrean Fields Burning Fields. This caldera has no volcanic cone, which is usually the case with calderas, to reveal that huge masses of magma are bubbling underground to the west of Naples. During the last big eruption, which as far as I know was about 40,000 years ago, the Earth's crust collapsed after the huge magma chamber had emptied and formed the 12-kilometer-wide caldera, which is actually a gigantic volcanic crater. This caldera, said Svath, would become the most dangerous in Europe if it erupted in the third millennium, at which time many millions of human beings would have settled in the entire caldera area, and most of them would have been killed, and all human beings' achievements would also have been destroyed. But similar things would also happen one day with regard to the Eiffel caldera in Germany and the Yellowstone caldera, whereby also with the Andreas Fault in the USA, where, seen from today, a very severe earthquake would occur in the foreseeable future,
To which, however, you are not to give any details, even though my father has given them to you, because...
I am sorry, but that is clear to me, which is why I did not want to say anything of the sort, but only that it will then cause a huge catastrophe. It would be irresponsible to predict such an event or any other event with exact dates, because on the one hand it would stir up fear and panic, while on the other hand, paradoxically, nothing at all would be done to prevent the serious consequences of the catastrophe in terms of the mass death of human beings. The only way to prevent mass deaths would be to relocate the entire population of the endangered areas to safer areas at an early stage. But this is also impossible due to the indifference and irrationality of the endangered population, because this only possibility would fall on deaf ears, while it would also be impossible due to the overpopulation of other areas. The same problem, however, would arise through the unreasonableness of human beings also with regard to a violent eruption of Vesuvius, just as in other countries where hundreds of thousands or even millions of human beings live in danger zones of volcanoes and calderas. In addition, however, such a prediction with exact dates of occurrence would cause trouble and enmity with know-it-alls and other lunatics, as well as the religious sectarian delusion would get a tremendous boost. If, however, the Naples caldera were to blow up in the coming period on about the same scale as it did some 40,000 years ago, that is to say that not only various volcanoes were to erupt, which could possibly result from the Phlegrean Fields comprising dozens of eruption craters over 150 square kilometers. The consequences would be catastrophic, not only because of the supervolcano itself, but also because a great many human beings would die and also because the Mediterranean would be swept by several tsunamis and all the countries around would be flooded far into the land. In addition, all of Europe would be covered with ash and the sky would be darkened and carry a veil of dust for years, drastically changing the world climate and causing rapid cooling. However, the same will then also happen with the Eiffel caldera and the Yellowstone caldera, both of which will increasingly lose their relative dormancy and also become more and more of a danger. While such supervolcano infernos occur very rarely, with intervening periods of several 100,000 years, when it does happen, there are world catastrophes every time. Svath also said that it was possible that 2 or even 3 of the world's 12 or so calderas could erupt simultaneously or in quick succession because of eruption-induced tremors and thus vibrational connections between the calderas, as is also the case with simple volcanoes. On the one hand, this would happen in this way, through vibrations, and on the other hand, through the seething semi-liquid interior of the Earth, which would rapidly transmit the vibrations of every volcanic eruption. This would then spread around the globe and thus also influence the activity of other volcanoes, causing further volcanic eruptions. However, this is something that is still unknown to earthly volcanologists.
What you say and what my father explained to you corresponds to facts, which are also clear to the earthly scientists who deal with this matter. But with regard to the fact that there are influences and connections between calderas and volcanoes, whereby one caldera can also cause another to erupt by influencing it, as is also the case with regard to volcanoes, whereby under certain circumstances chain reactions can also be triggered worldwide. This is actually not yet known to the scientists, and therefore also not clear to them, because they are still ignorant in this respect, and at present only harbor initial suspicions, which, however, they have not yet been able to prove.
Aha, so they are on the case then. But look here, this is an anonymous letter in which they write to me that I am politicizing and advocating too much positivity with regard to Russia and President Putin, while on the other hand I completely misunderstand Trump as well as foul-mouthedly insulting the citizens of Switzerland who are pro-EU. Actually, I wanted to destroy this letter first, as I usually do with every anonymous letter, but I will also do so once I have given it to you to read. Please read it and then tell me what you think.
Ptaah reads the few lines.
I cannot support this view, because what you have always written and published about Russia and Putin up to now, as well as your opinions, correspond in every respect to the facts, which you have also always presented in an unbiased, apolitical, and impartial manner. And as far as EU friendliness is concerned, I think that also in this respect your statements on this matter are of the right, because any EU friendliness cannot be reconciled with neutrality, freedom, peace, and the Swiss federal constitution, and consequently EU-friendly actions. Deeds and behavior with regard to EU accession attempts and such thinking alone are tantamount to a betrayal of the country or of Switzerland, its population, and the federal constitution.
Thanks. That is actually what I myself also see, because what I write in each case and also express my opinion in this regard corresponds exactly to how you express it. And when I speak and write in relation to these factors, it has nothing to do with politicizing or taking sides, but everything to do with my free expression of opinion in logical consideration and assessment of the respective facts. I also refer to human beings, without being their friend or enemy, because fundamentally I see in them only human beings and nothing else, whose actions, doings, and behavior I nevertheless endeavor to judge logically according to their ways and means in accordance with my ability. And when I then summarize these assessments, I use terms and words that are common in the vernacular and popular understanding and express what actually corresponds to the actions, deeds, and behavior. This, however, effectively always refers only to the actions, deeds, and behavior. And also when I call someone a lunatic or crazy, because with such terms, descriptions, and words I am not attacking and criticizing the human beings as such, but their actions, deeds, and behavior. If, however, this is wrongly defined and not understood or accepted by critics and other antagonists, then on the one hand, this is their sick and stupid way of criticizing something wrong. And on the other hand, such wrong behavior clearly indicates that such antagonists, know-it-alls, and critics lack the necessary intelligence. But now back to Russia and its president. Unfortunately, I do not know Putin personally, but I appreciate his way, manner, and effort with regard to the fact that he is peaceful to the world and always displays a healthy and reasonable activism by trying to solve and settle negative and, under certain circumstances, dangerous world political problems through rational and reasonable conversations and mediations, etc., which is lacking in other state powers. This is the case, for example, with regard to the matter between the USA and North Korea, which have always been addicted to violence. Quarrels, bickering, and world domination in the USA currently led by Donald Trump and his cohorts, and with regard to North Korea by the firecracker dictator Kim Jong-un. These two are equally sick, psychopathic and confused, whereby they are obviously only concerned with their insane behavior in power and their confused ideas. And they are also warmongering, crazy types who obviously lack any clear sense, but also reason and rationality, righteousness, understanding, the ability to think clearly, insight, the ability to recognize and effectively also the necessary intelligence. But as for the lie that I would foul-mouthedly insult those citizens of Switzerland who are flirting with the EU dictatorship and are treacherously trying to drive the people of Switzerland into the dirty clutches of the EU dictatorship with their stupidity and with all kinds of sleazy means, deceitfulness, lying to the people and misleading the people, etc., that is probably more than just a wicked and lying misrepresentation. As far as I know, I have only ever denounced the stupidity and lies, and also every crazy, insane, and confused action, deed, and behavior of these traitors to the homeland, just as I described the whole thing earlier. Although I have never attacked these persons as human beings and have also not insulted them, but only the stupidity, the insane and confused actions and behavior, as well as the clear lack of common sense, reason, and the necessary intelligence, which inevitably also leads to idiotic dodges, deceptions, underhandedness, practices, double-dealing and cross-purposes, etc., etc. But as far as the treachery of those Swiss who are intent on betraying Switzerland and handing it over to the EU dictatorship and making it their vassal state is concerned, they really should have their Swiss citizenship revoked and be expelled from the country, because such treachery is tantamount to treason. It does not matter which elements belong to this treasonous group, that is to say also useless people from certain parties, the Council of States, the National Council, or the highest level, because those who betray their homeland and are dishonorable in this way do not belong in such positions, nor in Switzerland. If our ancestors, who sacrificed their blood and their lives for our confederation, our peace, our freedom and security, were to experience today what these traitors presume to do, they would turn in their graves and writhe in misery, shame, pain, and tears. But the conscienceless and irresponsible homeland traitors do not care about that, just as they do not see the homeland of Switzerland in its splendor and in all that makes life in peace, freedom, security, and prosperity so worth living as it is not given or even possible in any other country on the whole earth. But the traitors to their homeland are so stupid, dim-witted, and intelligenceless that they do not realize that they live in a good, modern, and cosmopolitan country, Switzerland, which is really the best homeland in the world and offers a place where every human being, also real refugees, immigrants, and resettled persons, can live in peace, freedom, and security, where they do not have to be afraid. Worldwide, Switzerland is probably the most attractive and successful country, which is also at the top of the innovation list, or rather, which is constantly conquering new areas and bringing everything up to date through the application of new processes and the introduction of new techniques, from which the entire Swiss population benefits. Switzerland's neutrality is also an extremely important factor that is envied by many countries, as is its cultivated semi-democracy, also known as direct democracy. Political stability, legal security, the economy and the education system, as well as the quality of life of the Swiss population, as well as much more, also embody the basic pillars of Switzerland, through which everything is made livable and a privileged life is made possible for all Swiss and all other human beings living in Switzerland. This also means that Switzerland is a very attractive country in terms of work and earnings, as well as for tourists and law-abiding immigrants. It is therefore not surprising that hundreds of thousands of righteous human beings with a migration background in Switzerland make an important and great contribution to the country as a whole on a daily basis, and have also found a new, peaceful, free, and secure home here. This corresponds to reality, which also proves that these well-integrated international human beings make an important economic and social contribution to Switzerland, and that they do not in fact represent an enemy image, as is nonsensically claimed by the unreasonable. These Swiss civic-minded human beings with a migration background are an enrichment for their new homeland, Switzerland, as is also the case for their righteous descendants, the Secondos, and all these human beings deserve full recognition and appreciation. This must also be said, and has nothing to do with the fact that nowadays the threatening finger is raised or has to be raised with regard to refugees and new immigrants from other states. In order to counteract over-foreignization, an increase in criminalization and crime, as well as a cultural alienation, etc., the necessary understanding must therefore be shown for this. Therefore, the necessary understanding must be shown for this, but also for all those who have immigrated to Switzerland by right and who have been integrated, who came from other countries as righteous human beings, who, like the righteous population in general, work and pay taxes for the well-being, the existence and the advancement, etc. of Switzerland. It is also a fact that the righteous population of Switzerland contributes everything to shaping and securing the future of the country in a righteous manner. Consequently, the whole thing in this respect is not only the task of the state apparatus, but also of the population and the politicians. Consequently, all of them together and jointly bear the responsibility for the image of society and the well-being, peace, freedom, and security of the country, which must be controlled as a whole by reason and rationality, by correct actions, deeds, and behavior. The vast majority of the Swiss population is also grateful to be able to live and work in this country, which is why they are also motivated and committed to preserving this high quality of life. The more the majority of the righteous Swiss population works, directly or indirectly, to preserve all the values that have made Switzerland so strong, the greater the likelihood that this will preserve the livable, successful, peaceful, free, and secure Switzerland for all the human beings living in it, but also that it will be just as independent and secure a home for their descendants.
Your comments are impressive.
What I say are my honest thoughts, which also correspond to my attitude and opinion. Of course, there are, as everywhere also in Switzerland, things that could and should be improved, because in all and everything is always only relatively perfect, because there is nothing that is effectively perfect. Perfection does not even exist in relation to creation, which embodies itself as nature and the entire universe. For this is all creation, not an imaginary deity invented by delusional human beings, and proves through its constant changes and continuous evolutionary developments that everything and anything is never perfect, but is subject to unstoppable innovation, increase, improvement, and further development. So I think that in this respect there are also factors in Switzerland that would have to, or should be further developed, such as the preamble, which is set forth in the Federal Constitution of the Swiss Confederation from the 18th of April 1999, as of the 1st of January 2016, as follows.
Federal Constitution Preamble. In the name of God Almighty, the Swiss people and the cantons, in their responsibility towards creation, in their endeavor to renew the Confederation, in order to strengthen freedom and democracy, independence and peace and solidarity and openness towards the world, in their will to live their diversity in unity, in mutual consideration and respect, in their awareness of their common achievements and their responsibility towards future generations, certain that only those who use their freedom are free, and that the strength of the people is measured by the well-being of the weak, give themselves the following constitution. The articles of the Federal Constitution follow.
In addition, I would suggest that a new and contemporary preamble should be written, for example, in the same or similar framework as I have written the following.
Preamble. In the name of honor, equality, and dignity, it is the duty of all human beings of the Swiss people, the country, and the cantons to preserve freedom as well as peace, to uphold and renew the Confederation, to uphold democracy and justice, neutrality and independence, always bearing responsibility towards all creation, all life, to live in unity in mutual consideration and respect for their diversity, in vigilant awareness of our common achievements and our debt to all future generations, in the certainty that only those are free who make liberal and tolerant use of their rights and work in openness and solidarity, and strengthening the people, the country, and the world, measuring themselves by the welfare of the weak and honoring this in the Constitution. Simos A. Silver Star Center, the 5th of November, 2015, 23:44 hours, Billy.
I also find one thing in the Federal Constitution that needs to be addressed and renewed, and that is regarding the peace factor, because it is not brought up in the whole Constitution, only freedom, as in the following 2 articles. Art. 2/1. Purpose. The Swiss Confederation shall protect the liberty and rights of the people and preserve the independence and security of the country. Art. 10 halves. Right to life and personal liberty. Every human being has the right to personal liberty, in particular to physical and mental integrity, and to freedom of movement. Articles 15, 16, 17, 18, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 27, and 28 also deal with freedom, but not with peace, as this is only mentioned in art. 58 halves as follows. Art. 58 halves Army. The army shall serve to prevent war and contribute to the maintenance of peace. It shall defend the country and its people. It supports the civilian authorities in warding off serious threats to internal security and in dealing with other extraordinary situations. The law may provide for further tasks. In my opinion, this article says practically nothing with regard to Switzerland's peacekeeping behavior in relation to its own country and towards foreign countries, which is why I think that from this point of view it would be urgently necessary to introduce a separate or additional article into the federal constitution. Of course, this would have to be done democratically, because I think the electorate would be responsible for this. Such an article could, for example, read as follows and clarify the matter. Art. Right to peace. The Swiss Confederation shall maintain and protect peace, liberty and security through the Swiss armed forces, politics, governance, and population, and with all related rights of citizenship in its own country, as peace is also maintained in an unrestricted and neutral manner towards all other countries, states, and their peoples. What do you think of this, my friend?
According to what you have explained and listed, the fact of peace is indeed deficiently and insufficiently mentioned in the federal constitution, and only in unclear connection with the army, which contributes to the preservation of peace by preventing war and defending the country and its people. The whole thing corresponds to a somewhat strange and unclear formulation, and moreover says nothing about maintaining and protecting peace in one's own country and also with other countries. Subsequently, it would require an innovation with regard to the interpretation and preservation of peace. Its care and protection by the army, politics, the government, and the people, whereby I consider your proposal to be acceptable, at least just in the formulation and correctness that you have created.
Thanks for your assessment. However, I doubt whether my suggestion will ever be taken into consideration by influential people, parties, or even those in power, because I guess that as a simple non-political man from the citizenry, I have no chance of being heard. This is especially also because I do not hold back with my well-considered opinion regarding injustice and wrong behavior of those unrighteous people who are in charge in the media and in the governments, and who are harmful to the population, the state and the truth by misinformation, etc., or who out themselves as traitors to the homeland. This is also the case with your and my warnings and predictions regarding impending political, economic, and religious sectarian world events, as well as with regard to natural disasters and the consequences of overpopulation. And it is also a fact that many of the elite acrobats of governments, political parties, homeland traitors, politicians, economic magnates, and powerful capitalists, etc., whom I have cited and exposed, pretend to be righteous during the day, who, during the day, pose as righteous, gentle, and devout members of religions or sects, and thus as good human beings, and also diligently throw around Bible verses and God's words, make their speeches, and even pray hypocritically, only to let out in the evening what is really bad for their real, unpeaceful, dangerous, dishonest, unrighteous, and compassionless thinking, believing, acting, doing, and behaving, be it in relation to one's own family, which is then bullied, or otherwise in some way of injustice, hatred, or violence, etc. However, I must specifically explain, as is always necessary when I clarify something and denounce the unjust, because everything is always misunderstood or maliciously and enviously interpreted and twisted by antagonists, know-it-alls, and troublemakers of both sexes as a result of their lack of intelligence, that I am not, never and under no circumstances to be understood in this way by all those righteous human beings, or rather human beings of the world. I am not talking in this way, never and in no way about all those righteous human beings or leaders of the state, civil servants, politicians, economic and capital powers and party leaders, etc., who are honest, conscientiously working, acting, doing, blameless, solid, trustworthy, decent, loud, clean, upright, sincere, truth-loving, without falsehoods, capable, patented, orderly, honorable, of good character, reliable, dependable, brave, and correctly fulfilling their duty. And to this I must add that fortunately enough, such honorable human beings are active in the state leaderships, among the state officials, politicians, capital powers, and in the political parties as well as in the business community, and are endeavoring to do everything for the best for the good of the people and the country, and that too in the relationship by always endeavoring to restrain all those wrongdoers in their government. Official, business, political, party, and capital circles who only have in mind and represent their power, their own good and their advantages in every respect.
That you always have to make this clear. That is understandable to me, because many malicious Earth humans make it a point to insult you and the truth with lying attacks in order to lift themselves up and to be able to believe that they are great. Knowledgeable, educated, and by their insults, lies, and slanders are respected and irresistible to their fellow human beings.
Yes, that is unfortunately the case.
Then we should now turn to things that should not be official, after which I must leave.
Of course, then I will start with the following.